So with that, let's take a look at how to perform an end-to-end import of a simple entity. We'll do the demo at a high level and then dig deeper into some of the concepts later on in the lesson. In this example, I'm going to show you how to import vendors from a CSV file into AX. We'll use the sample files provided with Microsoft Dynamics AX, so you can also try this on your installation. I'm now in AX in the Data Import-Export Framework module. First, let's just double check the Data Import-Export Framework parameters to make sure that the service is still validated. I'm going to click on Validate, and I still have the green check mark. I can now close this dialog. Then let's also go into the source data formats and create a new source data format. I'm going to create a source data format for a CSV file. So I'll name the source name as CSV. If I expand this a little bit to the right, there's a type drop down here. You have file, AX, and ODBC. We're going to select this as file. Then on the right side, you have a number of different parameters for the CSV source type. We want to make sure that the file format is delimited. It can also be fixed with XML or Excel. The first row of this file is going to contain the header, so we're going to leave that checkbox checked. For the row delimiter, we're going to use CRLF, which is basically a line feed. For the column delimiter, we're going to use a comma. This means that every record in this file is going to be on a new line, and different fields within that record are going to be separated by comma. You can also specify a text qualifier, and what a text qualifier is when you have a column that might be text like a description, the text itself might contain commas, and you don't want to treat those as separate columns, but you want to treat them as the same column. What a text qualifier does is if you specify that quotation marks is a text qualifier, everything that's in between quotation marks is going to be treated as one column. We're going to leave the code page as 1252 and then leave the Unicode checkbox unchecked and the language locale as ENUS. The language locale is used to convert things like date formats and currency formats and things like that. There's also another parameter called the multiple value separator parameter, and what this does is it helps you have multiple values within a single field. An example of this is if you say have multiple email addresses for a customer, instead of having these email addresses on separate rows, for the field that contains email addresses, you could separate all of the email addresses with semicolon. The framework then creates separate records in the database for each email address that's in that column. Then let's click on the Application tab, and here you have a few other properties that you can set. One is the dimension code. We're going to choose cost center and department for the dimension code, and then press OK. The chart of accounts delimiter is going to be a dash, and you can see the dimension format is cost center dash department. What this means is if there is a dimension field within your CSV file, as long as it is in the same format as cost center dash department, it will get imported properly within the data import-export framework. The last parameter that we're going to set up in the source data format is the name sequence. Each file might contain the names in different order. For instance, you might have the first name followed by the last name. You might have first, last, and middle, and so on. In this setting here, we're selecting how the names are going to be in the file. So let's just select first, last, and then close this form. With that, we've completed setting up the source data formats, and now we're ready to create a processing group. As you recall from the previous module, a processing group is basically a unit of doing an import or export. And here we're going to create a processing group for importing vendors. So I'm going to call the group name as vendor. And then I need to save this record before I can continue. And once I've saved the record, the entities button is enabled on the processing group. So click on the entities button to bring up a new dialog. And here you can add multiple entities for that you want to import. In our case, we just want to import one entity, which is the vendor entity. So first, select the vendor entity from the entity dropdown. Then you need to select the source data format. In our case, we've created a source data format called CSV, and we're going to import the vendors from a CSV file. So I'm going to select CSV as the source data format. You have a few other parameters here, one of which is the sequence. The sequence basically tells you the order in which these entities are imported. In our case, we just have one entity vendor. If you had multiple entities, say you had customers and customer addresses, you may want to import one of them before the other, and then you would use the sequence to specify the order. You also have the ability to turn on whether business logic is run in the insert or update method, or whether you need to run business validations that are there on the class. We're going to leave those unchecked and save this. The next thing that we need to do is specify a sample file which contains vendor data. And for this, we're going to point to the file that's the sample file that's there inside the data import-export framework directory. So click on the button to launch the dialog to find the sample file. The sample files are located in different locations depending on what version of the data import-export framework you're running. If you are running the data import-export framework for CU7 or AX2012R3, then the sample files are located in Program Files x86, Microsoft Dynamics AX, then 60, Client, Demo files, and then you have two types of files, delimited and XML. Let's select delimited and then choose the vendor entity from this list. After you do this, you can click on the Generate Source File button to generate sorry, that was the wrong button. Generate the source file mapping button. And you'll see that the entity mapping has been done successfully. What this does is it reads the file looks at the columns that are there in the file, and then creates a mapping between the file and the staging table. Let me show you what the file looks like so you get an idea for the data in the file. I'm going to open this file in Notepad. You can see that the first row in this file is the column header. It has been set to wrap around. And it's saying that the first column is account number, the next column is name, name alias, and so on. After that, you have a set of data rows, one for each vendor that needs to be created. So this column here, DMF underscore V0101, is the account number for the first vendor that needs to be created. The next column is the name, and so on. Now that we've created the source mapping, we can look at the source mapping that was generated. So for instance, here you have the source, which is the list of columns that are there in the file. And then you have the staging table, which contains columns that are required for the vendor entity. Because the file had the same column names, the framework was automatically able to generate mapping between the column in the source and the column in the staging. For instance, account number in source is mapped to account number in staging. There might be cases, and this is quite common, that the file that you get from the source file that you have has completely different names than what's in the staging database table. In those cases, you may need to manually modify the mapping between the source and staging. We'll go into more detail about mapping source to staging in a later lesson in this module, so I'm going to continue from here. Then you can click on Validate to make sure the vendor entity has been validated for data import and export. If there are errors in your source mapping, you will see a message here that you can use to fix your configuration. After you've done the source mapping, you can look at the target mapping. The target mapping is, you can see the target mapping by clicking on the View Target Mapping button. That's a busy UI. The View Target Mapping button helps you map between the staging and the target tables. Here you also not only have the ability to map a field from staging to the target, you can also use functions to transform the data from staging into target. For instance, the generate postal address is a function which takes data from multiple fields in the staging table and then executes some X++ logic, and then it might update a particular field in the target. We'll talk more about the staging to target mapping again later, so I'm going to continue from here. After this, click on the preview source file to make sure that the data that's in the CSV file is being read correctly from within AX. So you can see at the bottom, the preview for the source file shows you how the data has been read from the CSV file into the various columns within this dialog. With that, we're done with defining the processing group, and I can close this dialog. Now, let's get the staging data which loads the file into the staging tables in AX. For this, you again go back to the processing group UI and then click on Get Staging Data. In the dialog that opens, you will see a job ID which tracks every execution of this processing group. You can provide a description if you want. Click OK. Then you get a new UI form which lets you define, which lets you choose where the data comes from for this particular entity. We're just going to run this and use the same file that we had defined for our sample file. Click on Run, and in the next dialog that opens, you're able to select whether this particular job is run using batch mode, which is asynchronously executing, or if you turn off the batch processing, then you can run this synchronously immediately when you press OK. We want to run this right away, so I'm going to press OK. Now you get a dialog once the insert has completed, and the dialog tells you that 4 vendor records have been inserted into staging. The next thing that you need to do after you've imported the data from a file into the staging table is to copy the data from the staging tables into the target. To do this, we again go back to the processing group, click on the double arrow, and click on Copy Data to Target. Now in the job ID, you can select the job ID that ran to copy data from the file to the staging table, and then specify a few other parameters such as whether you want to run this copy data to target for all records that are part of the job, or specific criteria. If you specify criteria, you could say you only want to run this job to copy data from staging to target for rows that previously had errored out because of maybe validation rules, or even rows that the user selects. In this case, we want to run the copy data to target for all records. So I'm going to leave the run for as all and press OK. Then in the dialog that opens, I'm just going to click on Run. And again, I have the option to run this particular job asynchronously using batch processing, or run it synchronously as soon as I press OK. Batch processing is particularly useful when you have when you need to import data using a recurring schedule. For instance, you might be getting data periodically from an external source via CSV files, and you could set up batch processing to run at the same schedule as the files are generated, and then import the data into AX. Now we want to just import this one file, copy the data from staging to target, so I'm going to press OK. With that, the data has been written to target. There was one error which we can take a look at when we talk about handling errors later in this module. Let's take a look at the data that was imported. I can go in from here in the processing group and click on Execution History. And here I can see all of the execution histories that have happened for this particular processing group. I can click on View Staging Data, and this shows me all of the records that have been imported from the file into staging and then from staging into target. You can see that the transfer status is completed. There is one record here where the transfer status is error. Now to look at the data that has been transferred from the file into target, I can select any one of these records and click on target. This takes me directly into the AX form for vendors in this particular case and shows me the migrated data. As you can see, it's created a new vendor with the vendor account as DMF_V0101. As you've seen, it's pretty easy to import an entity from a CSV file into AX. The data import-export framework handles a number of AX concepts such as number sequences, record IDs, surrogate keys, and relationships, all within the framework, so you don't have to worry about them. And since all of this is done leveraging the power of SSIS, you can import or export large amounts of data in a highly performant way. Now, go ahead and try this practice lesson that teaches you how to import a simple entity using the data import-export framework.